My name is Brendan Scott, and I'm historian in residence with Cavan County Council. And this short webisode will investigate the death of Margaret Livingstone in 1922, probably the most notorious event in Cavan's decade of centenaries period, or certainly one of them at least. But who was Margaret Livingstone, and what were the circumstances of her short life and her brutal death? This is what this webisode will discuss. Margaret Sophia Livingstone was born on the 29th of November 1908, the daughter of James Livingstone of Ardlougher, which is between kind of Ballyconnell and Kilshandra, and Mary Elizabeth Livingstone near Nee Thompson, also known as Minnie. James was a native of Ardlougher, and Mary was from Fermanagh. And this is a civil registration of Margaret's death, let's say on the 29th of November 1908. Her second name, you can see there's Margaret Sophia. James Livingstone of Ardlougher is the father. Mary Livingstone Nee Thompson. The job that is given to the father here is merchant, and that's he is the fellow who's given the information about the birth. James and Mary were married in the Church of Ireland, Church of Ahadrumsea, on the 20th of November 1907, and Margaret came along literally just over 12 months later, 12 months and a few days later. Their fathers were named as John Livingstone and William Thompson, who were both farmers, and the marriage was witnessed by William Kenny and Charlotte Thompson. And as I say, just 1 year following the marriage, Margaret came along, so she was the first child born to them. In the 1911 census, so 3 years later after Margaret was born, the Livingstones are said to be living in the townland of Dring, which is close to Kildallan, and there are 4 members recorded in Madge's family. Her parents, James and Mary, who we've met already, they were aged 39 and 31 years respectively in 1911. Margaret herself, who is known in the family as Madge, and her younger brother, William Redmond, who was aged 1 year, 1 years old in 1911. James's occupation at this point had changed from merchant to sub-postmaster, and Mary, his wife, was recorded as being an assistant in the post office, and that's their census there. You can see them all listed out there. They also had, you can see the last entry there is a young girl called Kate Riley, who was 12 years old, who was living with them as a domestic servant. Aside from Kate, who was a Catholic, the remainder of the household was noted as being Episcopalian. Episcopalian was a term that was used frequently at that point by members of the Church of Ireland, especially, as I said, during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as a lot of the Church of Ireland wished to distinguish themselves from the Church of England, whom they had felt had kind of abandoned them in the light of the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland in 1869. And so they wished to, I suppose, set themselves up or cast themselves as different from Church of England. So you do find in the 1911 census particularly, you find a lot of people listing themselves as being Episcopalian rather than Church of Ireland, which is what they were. And on the 14th of November 1911, not long after the census was taken, James and Mary's third and final child, a girl called Charlotte Florence, was born. So there's 3 children born to that marriage, and then James and Mary. So there was a five-piece family, as it were. Mary, the mother, sadly died on the 2nd of March 1916, aged only 37 years old from TB. She'd suffered from the illness for about 3 months, and James, her husband, was present at her death. And it must have been a terrible time of upheaval and uncertainty and grief in the family, for husband and children alike. But on the 22nd of September 1920, James, who is now listed as being 45 years old, married a 27-year-old from Knockadooce, which is a townland in Derrylin, County Fermanagh, and this was a girl called Mary Ross. But even though it's a townland in Derrylin, the townland Knockadoose's name is described in marriage registration as being in Ballyconnell, so it's probably straddling the border there. The marriage took place in Ballyconnell Parish Church and was witnessed by Mabel Ross and Alexander Berry. Mary's father, David Ross, was listed as being 78 years old in 1911, 9 years previously, and Mary had been living with her parents, two siblings and a niece in the household in 1911, 9 years previously. And this marriage between James and Mary would hopefully have given Madge and her siblings some sense of security, and the young girl and her new stepmother do seem to have been close. A daughter called Anna arrived on the 25th of August 1921, and Madge seemed to have spent her final days happily and busily, and was well known in the nearby town of Ballyconnell, where she cycled every day for music lessons and to pick up newspapers, probably for the shop, because they had a shop as well as the post office. She was later described by the local Church of Ireland rector as a nice and most promising girl. Now, we have to set Madge's life and death in the context of what's going on in Ireland at this time. And the Irish War of Independence, which began in 1919, ended officially with the signing of the truce on the 11th of July 1921, although violence still continued sporadically throughout the rest of the year. But following the ratification of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in early January 1922, tensions grew between the pro-treaty and anti-treaty camps. And for a number of years, there had been an increase in attacks on Protestants and Unionists all across Ireland, not just in Cavan. And Cavan was certainly no exception to this. The most recent and notable, probably, of these attacks in Cavan had been that on the gun attack on the home of Travers Blackley, the Farnham estate agent, which had happened on the 8th of April 1922. And if anyone's interested in that, there's an online talk that you can access through the library Facebook page, and I think the council's page as well, which I talked about Blackley and his experiences. So you can take a look at that again. And that attack allegedly ended in the death of 3 of the aggressors that night. Local big houses, RIC barracks, army barracks, courthouses, post vans, post offices, all came under attack during this period. And one particular tragic occurrence, which would have had a lot of resonance in Ardlougher, was the killing of Dean John Finlay, a Church of Ireland cleric of Brackley House in Bomboy, not far from Ardlougher. And that happened in July 1921. So these sort of things would have been playing in the minds of a lot of the local Protestant community at this time. And the tension, both between nationalists and unionists, and again, within pro-treaty and anti-treaty forces, this was a melting pot, really, which was all building and leading up to the tragic events which took place on the 18th of June, 1922. And although the Civil War didn't begin in earnest really until the 28th of June, 1922, as I say, tensions had been rising between both sides in the run-up to this date, and a level of disorder was beginning to make itself known. The sequence of events in the run-up to and following Madge's death is confused, and we can gather this when we read the reports of the killing in the Anglo-Celt. But as far as can be ascertained at this remove, and from a number of various sources, the following took place on the night of the 18th of June, 1922, which is just over 100 years ago from when this lecture goes out. A number of houses in the Ardlougher area, all seemingly Protestant houses, were visited that night on the 18th of June by a group of 7 armed men in a motor car, demanding guns and ammunition from the houses. The houses that were raided belonged to a man called William Morton, Dan Dellett, Almore Clinty, and Condell Clinty. James Livingstone's house seems to have been the final house visited that night. And when the men arrived at the Livingstone house, they demanded entrance. This is the house as it stands today, and is still actually owned by the Livingstone family. Now, James's wife, his second wife, Mary, displaying considerable courage, considering that there's 7 men outside their door demanding entrance, she went to a window and she demanded the men, what is it that they wanted? And she was told in no uncertain terms that, as with their other visits that night to the other houses, the men wanted guns and ammunition. Hearing this, Mary then asked them, "What need is there to raid for arms? Is there not a provisional government established?" So she had a certain amount of guts now doing that. The men outside were not in the mood for a political discourse, and they demanded entry to the property, saying that they had come a long journey. James was at the window at this point as well, and he handed out one gun through the window. Now, that didn't satisfy the men, and two of whom James noticed were carrying revolvers. James then handed over an old revolver, which he had held back initially, but that still didn't satisfy the men, who were demanding entry to the property. At some point during the confrontation, Madge, who at this point was 13 years old, she had woken up and gone into her parents' bedroom to find out what was going on. And she went to a small window where her stepmother Mary was standing to look outside. And at this point, 4 shots were fired by the group of men, and a cartridge loaded with heavy shot caught Margaret in the head, which, as the Anglo-Celt reported the following week, caused death instantly, portion of the skull being blown away. So it was a brutal death. Mary, the paper noted, who had been standing next to Madge, had the Celt said Mary had a providential escape, and she shouted to James, "Poor Madge is shot," because James had gone downstairs to talk to the men. The men, none of whom were masked, got into their car and drove away with the 2 guns that they'd got. So you can only imagine the scene in the house at this point, utter devastation and chaos. Captain Matthew Gray of Ballyconnell Force received word about the attack at about 7 o'clock in the morning, the following morning, and he took a car and 4 armed men with him to Ardlougher, where he found James standing on the road. Captain Gray climbed the stairs to find Madge's remains, and he reported in the inquest that Madge's remains were lying on her back with her right hand over her mouth and her left arm down by her side. Her head was facing the door. She was lying in a pool of blood. He could not exactly say where the wound was on her head, as it was bound by a cloth. So someone had obviously, James or Mary had wrapped poor girl's head in a cloth to try and stop the bleeding. It was too late. No one could have saved her. Her injuries were too traumatic. Gray called the Killashandra garrison as well, and Dr. Richardson of Newtown Gore and the Belturbet garrison were called as well, and representatives from each of those garrisons came out to Ardlougher as well. A.J. King, who was the Church of Ireland rector of Kildallan, was also one of the first on the scene. And leaving the house, Captain Gray found an empty cartridge on the road. The Dr. Richardson, he arrived at noon, and he inspected the dead girl. And at the inquest, which was held that day, Dr. Richardson made the following unflinching statement. This is quite brutal, really, and it was reported. This is exactly how it was reported in the Anglo-Celt. I was called this morning to view the remains of Margaret Livingstone, aged 14 years. She wasn't 14 yet. That would have been her age at her next birthday. I found her lying on her back on the doorway of the room just visited. There was an extensive fracture of the skull, the right half being practically blown away and the brains protruding, some brain matter adhering to the walls and ceiling of the room. Death was apparently due to laceration of the brain caused by a gunshot wound. Death must have been instantaneous. So a pretty unflinching commentary there. In the civil registration of her death, Madge was noted Madge was noted as being 13 years old and a merchant's daughter. The cause of death was recorded as being by gunshot wounds inflicted by some person or persons unknown. And upon leaving the house following his examination of Madge's remains, Dr. Richardson also discovered a rifle cartridge, as Captain Bray had earlier on. Now, following the tragedy, an inquest was quickly arranged. And as I say, Dr. Richardson, he was a locum. He was only covering the area because the usual doctor for that area, a guy called O'Rourke, who actually signs the death register there, even though he didn't inspect the body initially. O'Rourke was away on holidays. And the remains had been brought to another house, a guy called Thomas O'Brien's house. He also lived in the locality. 2 local justices, a county councillor named Thomas O'Reilly, John Drum, acted as the coroner, and the inquest was held in front of a jury at Thomas O'Brien's house, where the remains were laid out. The jury was made up of the following men: Andrew Tubman, W. Woods, Alexander Berry, John Lappin, William Nixon, Thomas O'Brien, who owned the house, Joe Crossan, James Abbott, Dennis Murray, Patrick McPartlin, and Ben Maguire. Mary Livingstone was called to make a statement, but as the Celt reported, she was in a state of frustration and she was excused from having to make a statement because she was obviously in shock as a result of the thing. Having heard evidence from James Livingstone, Dr. Richardson, and Captain Matthew Gray, the jury returned the unsurprising verdict that Madge had been killed by a gunshot wound, and they made the following resolution, proposed by the foreman, Alexander McLaughlin, and seconded by William Nixon. And they said as follows: that we, the jury, hereby tender our deepest sympathy to Mr. and Mrs. Livingstone, and view with horror such occurrences in our midst, trusting such steps as may be deemed advisable to be taken to protect the people of the district and ensure peace for all. But as the local Church of Ireland rector remarked a few years later, the Livingstones in those days lived in constant dread and fear. There was no real protection for houses and shops in those days. Madge's death was roundly condemned, unsurprisingly, in the locality, where it was noted she was a well-known and popular child, and it was remarked that the neighbourhood was horror-struck at the crime. News of Margaret's death had caused, as the Celt reported, a most painful sensation in the Ballyconnell and Ardlougher districts. Father Joseph Brady, the Roman Catholic curate at Ballyconnell, was strong in his condemnation of the event, and he remarked that words of his failed to make his condemnation of such an outrage strong enough. He had been called at 6 o'clock to see the child, 14 years old. Again, he's slightly wrong on the date or the age, dead in her parents' house, and it was a horrifying spectacle. It was terrible to think that men could wipe out the 5th and 7th commandments in their midst and disturb in their quiet and peaceful district by so foul and horrible a crime. He trusted the perpetrators would be brought to justice and that they would receive the punishment they so richly deserved. Father Brady's strong words were echoed by similar sentiments spoken by Father Charles McGee in Kildallen Catholic Church. Other newspapers also picked up the story and were universal in their condemnation on the attack on the Livingstones, which resulted in Madge's death. The Larne Times headline about the story read, "Murdered Cavan girl, arms raiders awful deed." They tell much the same story as everyone else, but they noted the 4 shots were fired at the house, one of which killed Madge. This report had also noted the Sinn Féin were investigating the attack, and the Republican forces are blamed for the outrage, as when leaving, they told the people that the Free State Party would protect them. It's all quite confused what's going on, who was responsible for this. The Irish Independent, so it made the national papers as well. The Irish Independent included Madge's death in a column dedicated to the deaths of 3 people owing to the disturbed times. And they wrote that the people are loudly calling for drastic measures to put down this disreputable conduct, which is being made much use of by Ireland's enemies abroad. The Northern Standard's headline on the 23rd of June read, "Little girl shot dead, shocking affair in County Cavan." They noted that the IRA were pursuing clues and hoped to make an arrest shortly. The Anglo-Celt also mentioned that the IRA were in possession of important clues. Representatives of the Killashandra and Kernafane brigades hoped that with the people's assistance, the culprits would be brought to justice, as no effort would be spared to endeavour to track them down. But in a report headed "More IRA Crimes," the Belfast Newsletter, which was a unionist paper, claimed that the group of men who attacked the Livingstones were a party of IRA. No arrest was ever made in this case, however, and the identities of the 7 men who arrived at Livingstone's house that night were never revealed. Now, one would think that surely the Livingstone family had suffered enough at this point, but more, if not worse, was to come. James later applied to the Irish Grants Committee, which was established in London for those based in Southern Ireland who could demonstrate that any losses they had suffered between 1921 and 23 were as a result of their loyalty to the British Crown. Lots of Protestant people applied to the IGC at this time, including, as I said there earlier on, Travers Blackley and his wife. They made an application to it as well. It was very, very common for this to happen. And according to his application, in which he requested £1,000, James's business was raided a number of times from 1921, before and after the shooting at his premises and home, with goods to the value of £10 having been stolen during a raid in 1923. Men's boots, shirts, tobacco and cigarettes were taken in another raid. And during this raid, focus was kept on the post office and its contents rather than the Livingstone's home part of the building, because as we saw in that earlier photograph, they were joined. But to compound this, following Madge's death in 1922, James's IGC application stated that boycott notices were put up in public places, as a result of which the claimant, i.e. James, suffered a serious loss in his small business. And the premises were raided again, as I say, in 1923. Then in 1926, the house was attacked again, with a considerable amount of goods in his shop destroyed and stolen, for which James received compensation of £29. And during one of these raids, perhaps the first one in October 1921, before Madge's death, Livingstone had resisted the raiders and managed to keep safe the post office money. James was also believed to have told the authorities the names of the raiders, although there is no proof that he did this. This, James's solicitor believed, had led to the subsequent attacks on Livingstone's premises and the boycott of his business. James received a grant of just over £62 from the IGC, but considering the scale of their losses, death of their child, he felt, understandably enough, I think, that this was not enough. And in a letter received by the IGC on the 7th of March 1926, James wrote the following: "Dear Sir, your letter and cheque for £62.10 received with grateful thanks, and as we said before, we considered the amount small for all we suffered. How thankful we would be if you would please be good enough to do a little better for us." This was also quite common. You'd put in a claim and then you didn't get what you claimed, and then you put in another claim and you might get a bit more. That was quite common at that time. James followed up that letter on his behalf from John Fagan's solicitors. He followed it up with a letter on his behalf from John Fagan's solicitors in Cavan town, and that recounted all of the misfortunes suffered by the Livingstones from 1921 onwards. Another letter from James to the IGC followed in December 1926, by which time the household numbered 6 children and 1 maid. And it recounted how our business was named by the IRA party. We have stuck to the post office and our home at no small sacrifice. Our pay for the post office now is £3.07 per month, which we are largely depending on. So they were in dire straits financially, and having suffered a dreadful, dreadful, dreadful loss with the death of their child, they're now being boycotted, which just rubbed further salt into the wounds. The local Church of Ireland rector, A.J. King, supporting James's application, wrote that Livingstone and all the family were and are decent, orderly, inoffensive people and deserving of nothing but respect and duty. James later received in total £375 from the IGC. Following this extremely tense period, things seemed to have settled down for the Livingstone family. The Livingstones remained on in Ardlougher, and indeed, as I said a minute ago, a member of the family still lives in that house. James himself died on the 18th of January 1958, and his second wife Mary survived him for almost 10 years, dying on the 7th of May 1968. It is difficult, I think, to escape the conclusion that the death of Margaret Livingstone on the 18th of June 1922 was one of the real low points in this disordered time, this revolutionary time. Her death was likely accidental. I don't think anyone went to the house that night with the intention of shooting dead a 13-year-old girl, but that is obviously cold comfort to the family and everything that they lost, and the bereavement that they must have suffered and the trauma that they must have suffered as well, who had such violence visited upon them that fateful night 100 years ago. And as I say, the fact that they continued to suffer unduly, almost losing their livelihood due to further raids and boycotts, as I say, it rubbed further salt into the wound there. So it's a sad story, really. For anyone who's interested in reading further about this, The genealogical information I got from the Roots Ireland website and Irish Genealogy, and the newspaper reports, particularly the one from the Anglo-Celt on the 24th of June 1922, has a very detailed report as to what happened, and they have the records from the inquest. They basically quote verbatim what happened at the inquest as well. So it's a really, really interesting piece. Nothing really has been written about Madge's death, or hasn't really been spoken about really since then. So there's not really much been done about it up to now. If you want to look at the actual at a lot of these grant applications to the Irish Grants Committee, they're available through the National Archives in London. And as I say, the Celt is always a great place to find further information as you go along as well. So as I suppose, just to finish off, my thanks as always to Cavan County Council, especially the Library Service, for their continued support and help, in particular Emma Clancy, Jonathan Smith, and Sinead McCardle, who do so much to help me with these as well. And a special word of thanks to the Livingstone family, who gave me their support and gave me some information along the way as well, especially Nigel Livingstone. So thank you very, very much to them for all their help and support while I was putting together this particular talk. And thank you to you all as well for tuning in, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon. Thank you.